Welcome back. Every week we go deeper into the lore of Middle-earth, and this week we are talking about a question that almost nobody asks. How many wizards were there? Because the answer is not 3, it is not 4, it is 5. And 2 of them walked east and were never heard from again. Most people know 3 wizards: Gandalf the Grey, who guided the Fellowship; Saruman the White, who betrayed it; Radagast the Brown, who spoke to birds and lost himself in the forests. Those 3 are in the books. They have names and stories and ending points. The other 2 have almost nothing: a handful of lines, a vague direction, a color, blue, and then silence. The history of Middle-earth is one of the most detailed mythologies ever constructed, and yet 2 of its most powerful beings simply disappear from the record entirely. They were called the Ithrin Luin, the Blue Wizards. Like all 5 Istari, they were Maiar, angelic spirits who had existed before the world was shaped, who had helped to sing creation into being at the command of Ilúvatar himself. They did not arrive as soldiers. None of the Istari did. They came as old men, clothed in mortal form, carrying staffs, stripped of their full divine power so that their help required cooperation rather than command. They were emissaries, not conquerors. Their names, as recorded in Tolkien's unfinished tales, were Alatar and Palando. In Tolkien's later writings, he gave them different names: Morinitar and Romistamo. The second set of names carries meaning: Darkness Slayer and East Helper. Names that speak of purpose rather than identity. Alatar was chosen by Orome, one of the great Valar, the hunter who rode through the early world and first found the elves awakening beside the waters. Palando came of his own choosing because Alatar was his closest friend, and he would not let him go alone. That detail matters. One wizard was sent, the other came willingly, out of friendship, into an unknown land with an uncertain fate. Before they had walked a single mile into Middle-earth, Palando had already done something the rest of the Order did not. The other 3 Istari came in the Third Age. The Blue Wizards came earlier, in the Second Age, in the years when Sauron was still building his power in the East, still forging alliances, still moving through the world in fair forms, still capable of disguise. This was deliberate. The Blue Wizards were not sent to stand beside Gondor or counsel the kings of men. They were sent specifically into the lands beyond, the east, the south, the wide territories where Sauron's reach was longest, and the free peoples had no one to speak for them. Tolkien's world is most detailed in its west, the Shire, Rohan, Gondor, Mordor. But Middle-earth is vast. East of Rhûn, south of Harad, there are entire civilizations, peoples Sauron had spent centuries courting, kingdoms he had folded into his service one by one, generation by generation. The Easterlings and Haradrim who march on Gondor in the War of the Ring did not choose Sauron out of wickedness. They were peoples who had been told for centuries that the Dark Lord was the great power of the world and resistance was death. Sauron had centuries to build that story. The Blue Wizards were sent to unmake it, to walk into countries that had never seen a wizard, among peoples who had only known the shadow, and do what Gandalf did in the West: find the spark of resistance, kindle it, keep it alive through the long years of waiting. They left the Grey Havens and walked east. Tolkien tells us this. He tells us the direction. He tells us the purpose. And then, in almost every account that survives, the record stops. There is no chronicle of what they found, no letter home, no mention in the annals of any kingdom. They walked into the east, and the written history of Middle-earth simply did not follow them. This is not an accident of storytelling. It is a fact about the nature of Middle-earth's history. The books we call The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion were written by hobbits and elves who lived in the West. Their records only reach as far as their eyes could see. Everything east of the known world is, in the surviving histories, a kind of darkness, not evil darkness, but the darkness of distance, of peoples whose stories were never written down in a form that reached Rivendell or the Shire or the archives of Gondor. The Blue Wizards walked into that darkness. And what happened there, whatever victories or failures took place in the unnamed East, was never recorded. Not because nothing happened, because no one was there to write it. For centuries, the only question anyone in the West asked about the Blue Wizards was whether they had survived at all. Some assumed they had simply died. Others believed they had faded, as Radagast faded. losing their purpose in the sheer weight of a world that had no edges. Then Tolkien's own letters surface a darker possibility. In one account, written when he was still uncertain about their fate, he suggests they may have done what Saruman did. That they found the task too hard, the distance too great, the loneliness too deep. That they fell. Saruman's corruption followed a clear pattern. He started with a true purpose: resist Sauron, counsel men, kindle hope. He ended by building his own power, his own army, his own plans. He did not fall in a single moment. He fell across centuries of small decisions, each one reasonable, each one wrong. The Blue Wizards faced that same pressure, but harder. Saruman at least had Orthanc, had Isengard, had councils with kings and the respect of the free peoples. The Blue Wizards had nothing but the road east and a mission no one would ever see them complete. In that first account, Tolkien writes that they may have founded magic cults and sorceries in the east, that the strange religious practices, the shadow worship, the lingering sects that persisted in eastern lands long after Sauron's fall may have been their legacy. Not intentional, a slow drift, a purpose lost. It is the saddest version of the story. Two friends who set out together, sustained each other through the long miles, and then, somewhere in the unnamed east, began to make the small compromises that eventually became something neither of them had planned. But Tolkien was not finished with them. He came back to the Blue Wizards in his later writings, and what he wrote the second time is different. In a letter written near the end of his life, he revisits the question directly. He says that he was wrong to think them failures. He writes that he now believes they were, in fact, largely responsible for one of the most important outcomes of the entire war. Sauron's armies in the Third Age came from the east and south. They were enormous. At Pelennor, men of Rhûn and Harad filled the field alongside the orcs of Mordor. These were not small raiding parties. These were organized kingdoms, with infantry and cavalry and war elephants answering a decades-long call to march. But Tolkien, looking at his own world carefully, points out something the history passes over quickly. Those armies could have been larger. Sauron had been building in the east for an age. The peoples there were many. His reach was long. The forces that actually arrived at the Black Gate were a fraction of what he might have summoned. Something held them back. Some force, working quietly in the east for centuries, had been fracturing Sauron's alliances, stirring revolt, planting doubt in kingdoms that would otherwise have marched. Something had been doing in the unnamed east exactly what Gandalf had been doing in the west for 2,000 years. Tolkien writes that he believes the Blue Wizards were that something. This is the version of the story that carries the most weight, the one his final thinking arrived at. Not two wizards who failed in obscurity, two wizards who won, quietly, completely, and in total anonymity, in countries that never made it into the histories. Think about what that means. Gandalf's victories were witnessed: the Battle of Helm's Deep, the stand on Khazad-dûm, the breaking of Saruman. These were seen by thousands, written into the annals of kingdoms, sung in the halls of Rohan and Gondor for generations. The Blue Wizards' victories were witnessed by no one who wrote them down. They happened in villages and kingdoms whose names do not appear in any surviving text. They happened in councils that Tolkien never showed us, in languages he never constructed, among peoples he never gave faces. That is not a smaller victory, it may be a larger one. When the Rohirrim rode to the relief of Minas Tirith, the calculation behind their charge was simple. They had enough men, and so did the enemy. But the enemy's full eastern strength had not arrived. The armies of the far east were late, or diminished, or fractured by internal conflict that traced back to decades of quiet resistance. Resistance the Blue Wizards may have spent their lives building. The free peoples of the West survived in part because the war that should have come from the East was not as large as it could have been. Nobody in the West knew why, nobody thought to ask. The victory was real, and the cause of it was invisible. There is something Tolkien understood about the shape of history. Most of what saves the world is never recorded. The letters that were never written, the conversations that changed someone's mind, the small acts of courage in rooms with no audience. These leave no trace, but they change everything. He built that understanding into the bones of the Lord of the Rings. Sam Gamgee is not in the histories. The hobbits barely are. The choices that actually destroyed the ring, Bilbo's pity, Frodo's mercy, Sam's refusal to leave were not the choices anyone was watching for. The Blue Wizards are the most extreme version of that pattern. Not just overlooked figures in a known history. Figures in a history that was never written at all. What would their days have looked like? Tolkien never says, but based on what the Istari were, Maiar clothed in mortal form, forbidden to dominate, only permitted to inspire, they would have worked slowly. Conversations, counsel, stories told in the right place at the right moment, probably not courts, probably not kings. The people most vulnerable to Sauron's influence were the common people of the East, the ones who had no choice but to serve the power that pressed on them from Mordor. Those are the people a wizard sent to kindle resistance would have found, and they would have grown old. Visibly, deliberately old, because that was the form they were given, the one that demanded cooperation rather than obedience. They could not simply appear in glory and command the East to resist. They had to earn it, day by day, year by year, across centuries. Gandalf spent 2,000 years in that work and had the entire Western world to sustain him. The elves of Rivendell and Lothlorien, the rangers, the councils, the occasional friend in a comfortable armchair in the Shire. The Blue Wizards had each other and the road. Tolkien never tells us whether they are still alive at the end of the story. After the ring is destroyed and the Third Age ends, Gandalf sails west. Saruman is dead. Radagast disappears into his forests. The Blue Wizards, wherever they are, whatever they became, send no word. Perhaps they sailed too in the end, without anyone in the West knowing they had returned. Perhaps they stayed, bound to the East by the work they had started, unable to leave it unfinished, unwilling to abandon the peoples they had spent centuries protecting. Perhaps they died, as Gandalf died on the bridge of Khazad-dûm, not finally, but genuinely, in the course of their work, and were not sent back. There was no one in the East to see it happen. There was no one to write it down. The uncertainty is not a flaw in the mythology. It is the point. Tolkien designed these two figures to exist at the edge of the story's vision, close enough to know they were there, far enough that the nature of their mission kept them permanently out of frame. A story about heroism in a history that records it is still a story about recognition. The Blue Wizards are a story about something harder, the willingness to do the work anyway, in the full understanding that no one will ever know. Their names alone carry a kind of answer: Morinatar, Darkness Slayer; Rumestamo, East Helper. These are not the names of wizards who failed. These are the names of wizards whose task was so specific, so far from the seen world, that success and failure both vanished into the same silence. Tolkien's final position on them, that they likely succeeded, that their quiet work in the East bent the war in ways the West never counted, is the one that fits his deepest convictions about how the world actually works. He believed that the free will of ordinary people, given the chance to resist, usually found a way to do it. He believed that courage, once kindled, was not easily extinguished, that a wizard who spent centuries planting that spark in the right places was not wasting his time. He believed most of all that the machinery of evil is fragile in ways evil never understands. Sauron's armies needed not just bodies, but belief. The conviction that the Dark Lord was inevitable, that resistance was pointless, that obedience was the only possible answer. Two wizards who spent centuries whispering the opposite were not doing nothing. They were dismantling, one conversation at a time, the architecture of despair that made Sauron's Eastern Empire possible. If what we explore here, the stories behind the story, the layers of the world Tolkien buried in silence, resonates with you, subscribe. There is so much still ahead, and we are here every week. The last time any record places the Blue Wizards with certainty is on the road east. Two old men in blue robes, walking away from the grey havens and everything familiar into a country whose name the histories do not preserve. They did not look back. The mission required the East. Whatever happened to them there, victory or failure, or something more complicated than either, happened out of sight, in the long silence between the known world and the edge of the map. Every mythology has its unnamed heroes, the ones who moved the world without leaving their name in it. Tolkien gave his unnamed heroes a color, a direction, and a disappearance, and trusted the reader to understand what that silence was actually saying. The Eastern armies came. The The war was hard. The free peoples barely survived. But barely is not nothing. Barely is, in fact, the whole story. Somewhere in the unnamed East, across centuries of roads and councils and conversations that left no written trace, two wizards in blue had made barely possible. Nobody in the West knew their names. The peoples they helped may not have known what they were. The histories they bent were never written. That is what it looks like when the right person goes to exactly the right place at exactly the right moment, and the world is saved so quietly that the world itself never notices. The blue wizards walked east. What they found there, we will never know. What they prevented, Middle-earth would not have survived without.